Hello. Thanks for inviting me to be here. Hope somebody can hear this. I can't tell yet whether or not it's working. I assume that it's working. I see myself. I hope you can see me too and hear me. I've got a pile of questions here that I was given. Watching for the comments just to see. I'm going to put a comment in here just to ask if anybody can actually hear and see this. Somebody let me know if you can. Otherwise, I'm just going to go ahead with this, and hopefully it is recording and doing what it's supposed to do, and we'll see. First question on this list of questions that I was given is, tell us about the first project you worked on when you knew you wanted to be a writer. And this is an impossible question for me to answer because I don't really remember a time when I didn't already think that I was a writer or that I knew I was going to be a writer. When I was a kid, probably high school age, I won a poetry contest from the Women's Literary Association of Illinois, and I actually won first and second place because I also wrote the poetry for my best friend Randy, who may or may not be watching this, and he took first place and I took second. He wouldn't give me the prize. Through high school, I wrote several stories, lots of poems. I remember that I wrote a story called "It Happened at the Top of the Stairs," and many years later, I rewrote that story, and it appeared in an anthology called 365 Scary Stories, where all the stories had to be 750 words or less, and 7 stories in that book, and that was one of them. So I've been kind of working on it since then. There was a long period of time just before I went into the Navy where I thought that I was a writer, and I told everybody that I was a writer, but I didn't really write anything. And then I took a course from Writer's Digest magazine called Writing to Self-Fiction with Jerry Williamson, who we sadly lost many years back. And he introduced me to what was Howl then, but became Horror Writers of America. He introduced me to the small press. And there was an organization back then called the Small Press Writers and Artists Organization. And I was heavily involved with that for many years, published my own magazine, The Tome, for about 13 issues. And shortly after that, started selling a lot more stories and doing a lot more novel-length things, longer things. It got harder. I sold probably 50, 60 stories before I even tried to write a novel. I wrote and sold my first novel on a Navy ship titled This Is My Blood. It was based on a story that I had published in a magazine called Starshore that was later reprinted in Carl Edward Wagner's Year's Best Horror Stories, which was fun because Carl told me he was never going to accept a vampire story. And there it was. And it was kind of cool because I got to become friends with him over the years. But anyway, the answer to the question simply is that I just don't remember a time when I didn't think writing was something I would do. It's obviously not all that I do. I've got a day job. I've got a Navy career behind me. I've got a big family. I have a herd of cats. But I've always been writing. And the second question segues nicely into what I've written more recently. Do I have a favorite character to write? I would probably have said Donovan DeChance up until now because the series, the DeChance Chronicles, has been a lot of fun. And the character himself is a lot of me. But along the way, I wrote a novella that is titled Nevermore, a novel of love, loss, and Edgar Allan Poe, and discovered that I like maybe writing Edgar Allan Poe stories as Edgar Allan Poe a little bit more even than I like writing about Donovan. And the two of them together, writing stories about both of them being together, has been interesting because they're both similar when I write them to my own thought patterns, and I have to be very careful to keep them different, to make Poe someone whose perspective is many, many, many years back, which unfortunately is also true of Donovan, who he's very long-lived and got that ability back in the early 1800s, so he was also around during that time. but definitely like writing Poe stories. I've written several inside these novels where Poe walks into the stories, meets a character that is himself or a doppelganger of himself, and lives through a slightly different version of the story. Kind of recently wrote a story called Masquerade that was in my novel A Midnight Dreary, and that's a retelling of the Mask of the Red Death, which has become kind of timely at this point, I think. Um, but yeah, I love writing. I love reading Poe. I love writing Poe, and I like the notion that he's still around. In the novel, in that story Masquerade, it explains why they found him on the park bench and why he was dead of mysterious causes and how he could still be alive to be in my novels. So that's fun. Has a character ever surprised me? Maybe you thought they were one way, but they turned out completely different. And can you tell us about this experience? I don't know that I have an answer to that. I don't know that they ever really surprise me. The situations surprise me, and then sometimes I have to think about how they would react to those situations. So, assuming that that counts as an answer, there's been several times when I, like in my novel Gideon's Curse, there's a minister named Gideon Swain who's come all the way from Illinois, from his safe congregation back in Illinois, to preach to the freedmen after the Civil War. Of course, he's not very well received by the North Carolinian gentry or the other preachers who are already here. Not particularly well received by the freedmen he wants to preach to, almost dies, and ends up living in their camp and learning a lot about himself through the situation. So it's possible that going in, I didn't really understand all the things that I was going to write about, and then you confront the situation in the novel itself in the story, and you have to think not only how do you feel about that, but how would this minister from Illinois, from the small bake sale capital of the world, come all the way across the country to cotton fields and slaves and make a message that means something to them? Hopefully, I got away with that. It spans several generations. It goes from that time with Gideon Swain back into Reconstruction all the way up into about the 1950s, where they still have the Polk family plantation, and it's run by a couple of redneck brothers and their dad. And there's some family secrets, zombies-ish, closest to a zombie novel that I've ever written. So I suppose that sort of answers that question. What do you do when you're just not motivated to write? Well, thankfully, I'm the CEO and publisher of Crossroad Press, and I never lack for something to do if I don't feel like writing. I can publish books by other people. I can design book interiors. I can find narrators for audiobooks. So far, we've got about 2,600 titles in digital, over 700 audiobooks from Clive Barker to people that you've never heard of before, and Hans Holzer's ghost story books. So there is always something to do here, and I can always play with the cats. So. I also play guitar. Try to write a little bit of music now and then. Been playing guitar for many, many years. Determined a long time ago that I was a mediocre musician and a better writer, so I've done more writing than playing. There's also bourbon. How do you balance writing, reading, family, and job? As if I was a juggler. I have a full-time day job. I'm an IT manager and security manager. Like I said, I'm CEO of Crossroad Press, and with Dave Dodd, who does a back-breaking amount of the work, and Trish, who does a lot of editing, and a few others who just kind of string along with us as proofreaders and editors. We are always cranking. So that starts pretty much from the time I get off work till the time I go to bed, unless I write. And in between, there's family, there's vacations, there's a lot of things. We just put a new addition on the back of the house, and everything's been kind of chaotic here. Sitting right now with the bookshelves behind me and what used to have a grand piano right here. And finally, we were able to move that into the room where it belongs so that we could have our dining room back. So now I'm at the dining room table. Do you write stories with an audience in mind? No. I write story, and this has been a problem probably for my career, and it might be why I'm not better known than I am. I write stories that have come to me and won't let go. I don't necessarily write in one genre or another. I have jumped so far to the side sometimes that I'm sure that the people who read the things that I'm writing have never heard of me at all. And the people who have heard of me are wondering, what in the world did you write that for? And, agents used to tell me this was a problem, but I just can't help it. Once I get something stuck in my head, that's what I'm writing, and I'm going to finish it regardless of whether there's an audience out there for it. I just hope that I do a good enough job and get it into enough hands that people notice. I am starting to get a little bit nervous here that there is nothing going on in this chat box to the left, which makes me wonder if anything is happening at all. But I'm going to just keep going until I get through the questions, and we'll see how it works out when it's done. How do you navigate the dilemma of writing characters of a different gender than your own? I try not to think about it. I know a lot of people. I mean, I went through the Navy, I went through years and years of world travel. I know so many people, and I just try to pay attention. And when I write a female character or a male character or whatever character, I usually have someone in mind that I base that character on, or some group of people in mind that I steal the characteristics from or the speech patterns from. Obviously, over recent years, I have tried much harder to round things out and to pay much greater attention to that kind of thing. But I mean, my very first novel was, I think I mentioned before, titled This Is My Blood, and the main character in that novel is Mary Magdalene, who is a fallen angel and raised by the devil out in the desert to tempt Christ with a woman in the flesh, which doesn't work. She wants to go back to heaven. And then she's cursed to follow him basically as a vampire throughout the rest of the Gospels. I wrote the entire novel from her point of view. Lilith is involved, and I guess that I did okay with that. I've never had a complaint of that type about my writing, but when I go back and look at it, I notice that there have been times when I have been short on having female characters in the books at all. So I worked on that a lot lately too, and it's possible that I'll be doing a spin-off from the Chance Chronicles with Amethyst, who is Donovan's love interest partner. She's a geomancer. She's got a lot of skills with crystals, the earth, and things like that. A whole different kind of magic and a whole different background, which I kind of get into a little bit in A Midnight Dreary when she's talking to Cletus J. Diggs and giving him basically her childhood story and how she got to be who she is. I do think people need to pay more attention to this. We have a lot of books at Crossroad Press that were written a long time ago. And sometimes it's hard to explain to older writers why things that they wrote in the 70s and 80s just aren't quite appropriate anymore. And also equally hard to explain sometimes to readers that these books weren't written now. The people who wrote them at a different time. They were published then. And what we're doing is reprinting things that were published. So it's not really a time for us to go back and get those books updated to modern times. That's just not what's being done. But it's definitely a problem. It's always been a problem. Too many big series and movie series and things have just completely ignored women, people of color, people of many different races, and it continues to go on. I have a friend, Steve Barnes, and he has a theory and a list, and it's huge, and I have to agree that he's almost 100% right that if you have a big famous movie and there is a black character, he's going to die first. And it happens so often that it's just crazy. Or if only one of them dies, it will be the black person. And especially if that black person was to have sexual relations with anyone during the movie, then he's done. And you get that in your head, and you think, wow, that's how things used to be. And then you watch something that was just made, and it happens again. It happened in Aquaman, when the father of the villain got killed right in the beginning. But I'm probably a little bit off topic there. So what made you realize you wanted to be an author, specifically a fantasy sci-fi author? well, that's what I read. When I was a kid, I read everything that was more than 300 pages and had elves on the cover. Um, all the trilogies, all the 5-book series, anything that would last and last, especially when I was in the Navy and I just didn't have a lot of other things to do. You're out at sea for weeks at a time. You've got nothing but reading and work. So um, then I joined the Horror Writers Association when I took that course, and that's when I started reading a little bit more King and Straub and Clive Barker, and realized that I kind of liked that kind of writing also. But what happened was, being part of that organization and then becoming president of the Horror Writers Association, I kind of got categorized as a horror writer when in fact I'm not sure that I've written as much horror as I have other things. So dark fantasy probably, I kind of align a little bit more with, for instance, Clive Barker. I think I've read almost everything that he's written, and his more fantasy related novels I really, really love, and his horror novels and the books of blood, which I also love, are probably not the kind of thing that I would write. So I don't know. I just never had any real. I've written mysteries and thrillers also. I wrote a political satire with Trish, my wife, called Remember Bowling Green: The Adventures of Frederick Douglass, Time Traveler, about how Ronald Crump tried to take over the city of Bowling Green, Kentucky. That was fun. And I guess it was a fantasy science fiction-ish novel, sort of, but mostly it was just based in modern times. The only real science fiction part of it was that Frederick Douglass popped in. So, and that was fun because it also got me to read a really, really long autobiography and then another biography about Frederick Douglass, and I learned a lot that I didn't know about history through that. So that's another thing that leads me to the things I write. I'll find something that really interests me and I'll read a whole bunch of stuff about it, and at some point my head will go, but what about? And the next thing I know, I'm writing. Tolkien, Martin, Rowling all revolutionized what we thought was possible and what became mainstream. Is moving the industry something you're interested in, and if so, in what direction? While I'll agree that Tolkien did that, I'm not sure that Martin and Rowling took things in all that big of a different direction. They just got very popular for some reason. I mean, there's a lot of people writing the same kinds of stories and have been for decades. Very good stories. But yes, the short answer is, of course, I'd like to take things into a direction that would be the David Wilson direction, so that people would, know my name the way that they know theirs. But as I said before, I write the stories that I write, and I think as often as not, it's a matter of timing. It's partially a matter of where you stand in the publishing world to start with. I mean, very popular people obviously have a huge leg up, and if they write something new and it catches on, it's more likely to catch on because people are going to see it. Right now, there's so many writers, so many publishers, so many books, that to stand out among all that as the next big thing is very difficult, and it's even more difficult when you can stand out with something like 50 Shades of Grey without even really being able to write very well. So I love all those guys. Tolkien, I don't know how many times I've read The Lord of the Rings. Probably more than I should have, because other books did not get read. And then I've listened to 2 different narrators do audiobooks of those. Same with Harry Potter. I love the Harry Potter stories. Not 100% sure what started me down that, but I had a long period of time where I lived in North Carolina, but worked in Virginia, and I had up to 2.5 hours a day in my car in audiobooks. So I read a lot of different books. I went through that whole Harry Potter series during that period and just fell in love with it. And the movies have been wonderful. They did a great job of casting. Unlike a lot of other people, I also like her adult mysteries. And the guy who narrates those happens to sound a lot like Hagrid, so it's kind of funny. If you could change the world by doing one thing, what is something you would change right away? Oh my God, right now at this particular point in time, there's so many things. I wish people cared a little bit more about other people. I wish everything we did in the world didn't devolve into thousands of people trying to figure out how to make money off of it. I wish the government didn't. I wish there wasn't a cat in my lap right now because he's big. Say hello, Thomas. Hello, Thomas. Um, I guess that would just be it. I just wish that people. It seems like most of the wars, most of the fighting, it all generates from governments and rich people. Most people don't care one way or the other about people from other races or other countries to the point where they would go to war and fight and kill each other over it. But since you get ordered to by people with more money or more power or more position, it goes on and on and on. It ruins the world. It's in a very bad place right now. I'm not going to get political on this, but I already mentioned the Ronald Crump story, and I think that probably puts my place in that pretty solidly on foundation. What's your favorite movie? All my life, I said my favorite movie was Blade Runner. I'm not sure that that's true. There's a whole list of movies that if they come on, I will watch them to the end every time without fail. A lot of them, other people just look at me and go like, "What's wrong with you?" Mystery Men is one. I love that movie. The chemistry between the characters is just perfect. Major League, A Fish Called Wanda. A lot of comedies. Blade Runner's still way up there. I like Clockwork Orange for what it was, but I don't know that I would watch that one over and over and over again. Independence Day, Twister. Not deep philosophical movies. I love movies like Green Day, The Green Mile. Not Green. We're getting to the band part that comes next. The Green Mile and Shawshank Redemption are just wonderful movies. There's so many. I hate questions like, "What is your favorite this?" Because my favorite this or that is different every time I think about it, and all depends on a lot of factors, what's going on, what we're watching at the time. Recently, I think the best thing I've seen on TV was Sense8, which actually came to a conclusion that made sense. Didn't kill everybody, didn't ruin everyone's lives. The writers didn't get pissed at the end because they were canceled and screw it all up. So probably that. Favorite band is the same way. Like I have a lot of favorite bands. Probably my long-term favorite band would be the Moody Blues, but that's just because that's the first rock band that I ever had a chance to just kick back and listen to. I was pretty young, and there were some college kids that lived next door, and they let us come over and just hang out. And they put on A Threshold of a Dream, and I've loved that album ever since. I grew up listening to a lot of 50s music and 60s music, and then launched into heavy metal, some classic rock. I'm not a big classic rock fan because I've just heard it too much, and I think it's like writing, reading, TV. If you just go back and watch, read, listen to the same things over and over again, you stop growing, and as soon as you stop growing, it gets harder to create anything relevant. As a writer, you have to be able to do that. So, recently I went to a concert with my daughter where I met a band called Beartooth that I really like. Another band, I Prevail, that was good. That led to my going out and listening to a lot of new bands and finding a whole bunch of bands that I like that I didn't know about, and remembering that I like Seether a lot. Led Zeppelin, obviously. Newest band that I liked that I found was called Dirty Honey. They sound a little bit like a mix between Led Zeppelin and AC/DC in the old days. But they've only been around for a couple of years, so it's weird. Recommend some fantasy or science fiction. Well, I can recommend a lot of stuff that we're publishing. I think if you like humorous science fiction or superhero kinds of things, you're really missing out if you have not checked out the works of C.T. Phipps in his supervillainy saga about Gary Karkovsky, aka Merciless, the supervillain without mercy. And yes, he's aware of the redundancy of that. It's hilarious. It goes on and on. It has so many cultural pop references that your head swims. He's done several other series for us. We've got a new science fiction novel coming up in July from Alma Alexander called The Second Star that I'm really excited about. I've got review copies of that in. We're doing a new novel in F. Paul Wilson's adversary cycle called Signals, and just today in the mail I got the print art copies for that, and it's a pretty book. Paul's amazing. I love the Repairman Jack books. The way he has created an entire universe is inspiring, and it's funny because I've written novel after novel after novel in many different places and settings, and what I've come to learn is that all of them came together. And you find references to almost every book that I've ever written in 4 or 5 different locations. I've even started purposely making references to events that happened in the other books because it just makes no sense not to. So I think it's interesting to see how that happened because I didn't plan it. It makes me wonder if Stephen King ever really planned for all of his books like Salem's Lot to end up in that Gunslinger series, because it seems unlikely at the beginning. And then wonder at what point he noticed and just started doing it. I like Ursula K. Le Guin. I like Anne McCaffrey. Have not read as much fantasy in recent years because I've read more mysteries and thrillers and horror. I think Peter Straub's The Throat, the trilogy that goes around that, Coco, The Throat, and Mystery, maybe the most amazing group of stories that I've ever read because of how, excuse me, from one book to the next, you get basically the same set of characters and the same set of events that you're absolutely certain you know what happened in the first one, but in the second one you find out you don't. And in the third one, it happens again. So very, very deep books that can also just be read as thrillers because they're great stories. So I would recommend him and anything by Stephen King because he's probably my favorite author. Excuse me. Got breathing cat hair. What's next for me writing and release-wise? I wish I knew release-wise. I have 3 major projects in the works right now. One I started quite a while back called Jurassic Park. That's kind of a follow-on alternate history novel to the Roland Crump book, and it started out being a satire that turned into a more serious book. And in that book, it's only 6,000 years to the beginning of history. Dinosaurs and men walk at the same time. And an old guy named Noah is building a boat out in the desert. And I won't go much further into it than that, but when I started writing the characters, main character being one of Noah's sons, the one that was later on basically excommunicated and sent off for not following the rules. I found that there was a lot more to the story than I thought there was, and I think it's going to end up being a good book. I'm not sure exactly where it's leading, but that one faltered a little bit when I stopped and wrote a book called Hoods, the beginning, that already came out, which is a young adult superhero novel set in San Valences, where Donovan DeChance lives. I've also been writing for many years a book called Tattered Remnants, and there's a book binder that I know, and he put together some really, really pretty books by hand and taught me how to do it. And during the period I was doing that, I started writing this book about a guy who's not exactly a serial killer, although he does kill people occasionally. He makes books out of parts of the things that he's making a book about. He does have a book called Grandfather. But he's not the killer in the book. He's helping a detective, a female detective who's got an eidetic memory and has been removed from a case for being too close to it and for getting a little bit crazy. And she's sent to his shop to learn a hobby because she's supposed to find some way to spend her time other than obsessing over the case that she's not on anymore, which is another serial killer. So that one's fun. And the first chapter of that was actually printed recently in the most recent Cemetery Dance Shivers collection, along with Stephen King's long lost story from the unnamed Harlan Ellison book that never happened. I think that's the story that was in there. So that was fun, and also led to Rich Chismar reading that and contacting me to write another story, which will be in a later volume of that series called Hickory Nuts and Bones that I recently finished and I believe might be the best short story that I've ever written. We'll see. He liked it, he took it, so he liked it too. The other book, the last thing that I'm working on, happened recently. I got this crazy idea that I would write a book in 10 chapters or around 10. Every chapter would be written at about 10,000 to 12,000 words. Each would contain the lyrics to a song by a band called Into Nothing, which is also the name of the book. So I've already got part one and the first song written and the script, because the third part of this is that I'm also writing a TV drama script for each chapter, so that at the end I'll have to pitch a novel, all those songs, and a possible TV series for streaming somewhere that I don't have any idea how to market. But that's the thing that I'm working on right now, and this is another time where my stories came back together, because part two, the whole story revolves around a guy named Jesse and a vision he has of this girl in an alley. And there's a lot of things, a lot of details in the alley, and each of those details kind of becomes one part of the book. One of the details is a spilled bottle that was an absinthe bottle. I wrote a story for an anthology many years ago that never happened, where all the stories were based on absinthe. And the story was titled The Milk of Paradise, which was eventually published at Gothic.net, and then was published in another magazine that's name slips my mind. But anyway, one of the characters in that story is the damsel with the dulcimer from Coleridge's poem. And she's going to play a part in this new novel, and I'm going to retell that story, The Milk of Paradise, as chapter 2 of this, only from the perspective of a different character. So that's been kind of an interesting thing. But the problem is, with the 3 projects going on at once, it's very difficult, especially with my limited writing time, to get myself to concentrate on one or the other. So I don't know which will be released first, whichever one finally manages to capture my attention long enough for me to finish it. And also I have to write a new Donovan DeChance novel and a new Hoods novel, so who knows. That's really all I had for the answers to the questions, and since the chat thing doesn't seem to be working, I have no idea if this is even showing up live like it's supposed to. Thought I would show a couple things. This is the novel Gideon's Curse that I mentioned before. This is the most recent novel that I have out, other than Hoods, the one about the kids. One of the recent anthologies I was in was 2113, which was all stories based on songs by the band Rush, another favorite band I'd like to mention. And mine's based on the story, on the song The Trees. I couldn't find another copy of it. This was the first book. This is My Blood, the first one that I sold. It's not the first one to come out, which is another odd story, because the publisher went under and it was published by somebody else later. But my first book was a Star Trek book, Chrysalis, number 12 in the Voyager series. This was the first Donovan DeChance book published. This is the old 5-star edition. After this, I wrote a book called Heart of a Dragon that turned out to be a prequel to this. So this became book 2, even though here it clearly says volume 1 on this old version. There's 6 books in that series now, if you count Nevermore, which is not really a Donovan DeChance novel, but he does pop in right at the end. Since I don't see any kind of chat or other questions here, I am going to end this now with that. Thank you guys for having me. I hope something here was interesting. Hope I'm not completely boring, and I hope you all have a great weekend. Be safe out there.